Solutions, policies, and problems. Oh my, where to begin? This is a huge subject, and there just isn't enough time to go over everything. But I want you to keep something in mind. We've been talking about solutions and policies and problems since day one. I mean, really. Solutions to this or that, deficiencies, over and undernutrition, obesogenic environments, problems in the food systems, comparing food systems, and how that highlights aspects of solutions, policies, and problems. However, in this lecture, I want to cover a number of issues and offer some basic and straightforward solutions on both the global and the local scales. Crops. We have talked about planting crops. And what does that mean? How do we go about that? Well, it starts with clearing the land, right? You have to clear the wetlands or clear the prairie or clear the forest and replace that with crops. And what does that mean? Well, that means that you lose soil nutrients and you lose more and more each time you plant and harvest. So in order to counter that, fertilizer has to be applied. But that creates a problem because fertilizer runs off into the waterways with rain or irrigation. And that stimulates algae to grow. And algae does grow. And it grows and it dies and it decomposes, and therefore it depletes the oxygen that's in those water supplies. And that leads to these massive dead zones, killing not just, freshwater animals, but marine wildlife as well as terrestrial wildlife. To protect the crops from weeds and pests, we also use herbicides and pesticides, which kills not just weeds and pests. It kills native plants. Of course, the whole idea of a weed is, biased. That only exists within a certain construct. And it kills native plants and insects and animals and those that eat those plants and insects and animals. And as plants and insects begin to adapt to the chemicals, we have to use more and more and more of those chemicals. And the chemical residues are also in our food, and that is creating health problems for us, the consumers. In addition to that, the fields are also irrigated, and water evaporates, right? But what doesn't evaporate is the salt that's in water. So salt accumulates on the surface eventually over time, and that means plant growth begins to fail. So you begin to irrigate more and more, which uses river and lake and other water reserves and well water, which are already drying up, and the water table of entire regions are being lowered to a degree that the surface is now very similar to a desert. Ironically, the more water we use, the drier the region becomes. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, oh, that's the crops. What about livestock? Well, like with crops, livestock uses land. Herds occupy land that was, of course, once natural and had people that lived on that land. So you change the land, and that means you lose native plants and animals. Many of the same issues are the same with livestock as with crops. You get soil erosion, you get water depletion, you get desert formation, and also you have masses of animals, right? And those animals are just being fed to grow them quickly, which means that there is a lot of defecation. They produce waste, and that can contaminate the water and the soil. And on top of that, our animals in feedlots are fed grain, which has to be grown somewhere, right, for them. Somewhere else. It's not grown on that land. So more land is needed than what you actually see at the feedlot. including all the issues with, of course, fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides and irrigation that go with growing the crops that are used to feed those animals. So in the U.S., more cropland is used to produce food, grain, for livestock than it is to produce food, which is to say grain, for us, people. There's a graphic right there that you can see on the bottom of the screen. And you may not be able to see it well enough, but one of those sacks of grain is supposed to equal 1 pound. And what it's showing you is how many sacks or pounds of grain it takes to equal 1 pound of a food item. So it takes 1 pound of grain to get 1 pound of bread. And that's a lot. But look at how much grain it takes to grow 1 pound of all of these meat items. It takes 2 sacks or 2 pounds of grain to get 1 pound of fish or 1 pound of chicken. 3 pounds of grain just to get 1 pound of pork. And 8 pounds of grain just to get 1 pound of beef. And there are also a number of issues surrounding fishing. We are rapidly depleting fish and marine animal populations, which means resources, which means food. By doing that, we change the balance of the ecosystem of marine life, and that has already had significant impacts on things like water quality. We use nets and lines, which kill indiscriminately not only food species but non-food species, which is partly why whales and dolphins and other marine life are endangered, and many on the verge of extinction. But simply going out and fishing, catching wild fish, that cannot meet consumer demand, which is why there has been fish farming or aquaculture. However, all farmed fish need to feed, and that food has to come from somewhere. If you were paying attention to the last slide talking about grain, fish were on that slide. Fish food comes from grain, and partly also from wild fish, which are caught to mix with the grain, and then that is fed to farmed fish. So this depletes the wild population as well, aquaculture. Plus, if the water becomes polluted, if you do not get water through the cages, and you have this bioaccumulation of toxins, that means that you cannot eat the fish as well. This system can be sustainable with the right technologies and practices, but in many cases it is not. And whether we're talking about crops or livestock or fishing, what we're ultimately talking about is energy. The food industry requires energy, which means burning of fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas. And that means air and water pollution, which leads to global warming and the depletion of the ozone layer, which leads to a changing climate, which is already happening. It's already having an impact not just on wildlife and ecosystems, but on people and people's livelihoods. And you can only speculate what that's going to mean. In the United States, the food industry uses 20% of all the energy that is used in the United States. And this is for running machinery and producing fertilizers or pesticides, for processing, for packaging, for transporting, for refrigerating, for storing. And it's not just a misuse of energy in our system, there is a misuse of water as well. Food production uses an enormous amount of water. It takes an estimated 1.5 million gallons of water to produce the food that one person in the U.S. needs for 1 year. And think about that for a second. Each of us has a water footprint of 1.5 million gallons every single year. And I don't think that most people are aware of these or want to think about these things. It takes 10 gallons of water just to produce one slice of bread. It takes 100 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of corn. It takes 10,000 gallons to produce a single pound of beef. And that water is quickly becoming contaminated. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency reports that 70% of the pollution in our rivers and streams, which includes the rivers and streams in this untouched land, our national parks, is from our food industry, from farming and packaging processes. Now, we just talked about crops and the depletion of water. Water is a cash crop itself because it is so depleted. There you can see kind of a fuzzy map of water-stressed regions around the world, either because there is no water or because the water in regions is contaminated. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says by 2025, our government says by 2025, that 2 out of every 3 people will live in a water-stressed region. And one issue that is very close to my heart is biodiversity, because I study some endangered primates, and I'm really concerned about the state of those primates and biodiversity in general. This is an issue that we could easily have a whole class about, biodiversity. Anyway, biodiversity, as I'm sure you are aware, is declining. By 2050, it's estimated that a minimum of 40,000 plants will be extinct, gone, extinct, no more. And that's just plants. I mean, if you look at primates and penguins and polar bears and marine mammals and ungulates and snakes and frogs and amphibians and butterflies and snails and slugs and ants and insects of all sorts, I mean, many animals are on the verge of extinction. Not just endangered, but critically endangered. We face losing somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of all animals, all species. For crops, if you take away, remember, variation, right? You have global food habits that are increasingly uniform. Wheat and rice and maize, etc. 75% of the food energy globally coming from just a few food crops, which means that local land is cleared and local plants are exterminated because they are not valued. But the climate is changing, and so are the pests. And without variation, without diversity, you have the perfect formula for our own extinction. And last is food waste, which we read an article about earlier in the term. This has a major environmental impact, not just in terms of throwing away food and squandering resources, but by contributing to the greenhouse gas effect. More than 1 billion tons of food is wasted every year. 1 billion! That puts the global production of cash crops in perspective, doesn't it? Think about this. We produce a lot of food, but we are wasting even more. And that means waste of not just the food, but of all the energy and the resources that were used to produce the food in the first place. Each year, food waste alone accounts for 25% of the water used and about 300 million barrels of oil. Gone. Wasted just like that food. And on top of that, you get landfills. Like that, all that waste has to go somewhere. Landfills that are actually full of food. Food that decomposes, and that decomposition produces methane and carbon dioxide, which leads to an increasing greenhouse gas effect. And the result, climate change. In case you're wondering why I'm ranting and raving about this, and you're wondering what the main point is, here is the main point. Our food production system is not sustainable. So the question becomes, what can we do, or what can be done? What are the sustainable solutions? Let me preface this by saying there's no way that we can go over everything and go into detail. There just isn't enough time unless I want to make this an hour and 20-minute lecture, which I'm not going to do. So let me just touch on some of the broader patterns. You can see on the screen that I've got a table or a chart up here, and you can pause this and read through that. I've also got some main points written on the side, which you can see near the side of the screen. That table has some sustainable and unsustainable methods. Now first, we do have sustainable agriculture, and for each of those environmental problems that agriculture causes, there are some farms and farmers that have implemented sustainable solutions. The ability to produce food indefinitely with little to no harm to the environment. And if you read through this table, the sustainable and unsustainable methods, you'll notice that many of the sustainable methods are low input and they are not new. These are methods that would have been familiar to your grandparents and to your great-grandparents. Things like rotating crops so you don't need so much fertilizer, and using cover crops to reduce water runoff and water and soil depletion, and replacing fertilizer with manure, and feeding livestock on the open range, and maintaining healthy animals, and maintaining natural diversity or diversity of crops as a deterrent against pests and changes in the environment, controlling the overuse of water, using renewable energy, among many, many others. How can we approach this on a global scale? Both developing and developed nations of the world need to work together to resolve hunger, poverty, and environmental degradation. In developing nations, we need contraceptive technology and family planning education that reaches the citizens, and same with poverty assistance programs. Now, neither of those are easy, and environmental protection programs are often operating within the system of globalization. So all that damage and resource extraction is related to trade and production. And that is being driven ultimately by consumer demand, consumer use, typically in places like the US. And in developed nations, these are nations that need to address wastefulness and pollution in food systems, their own food systems, where there needs to be education as well, in the sense of being a conscientious consumer, and for people to be engaged in relief programs, and not just giving away food or money or cash doles, which only are stopgap measures, but to be engaged in social programs that permanently improve lives and therefore solve problems. I mean, you've heard of the adage, if you give a person a fish, they feed for a day. But if you teach a person to fish, and to sustainably fish, they can feed for a lifetime. Being involved is not easy, but not being involved means that we are part of the problem. I often hear from students that I don't know where to go to get involved. First, you can always drop me a line or stop by the office. I've got lists and lists of organizations that you can join. On this slide, I've only got a few. These are hunger relief programs that you can join right now and be part of the change. And we can make an impact with our behavior and our lives, how we live our lives. If you eat more vegetables, not only because it's healthy, as you know from this course, but what are you actually eating in terms of the larger issues if you eat more vegetables? Well, you're eating foods that require less water, that require less fertilizer, less pesticides, less energy in their production compared to meat. So meat, by comparison, is a wasteful food, and it causes much more damage, right, in comparison. Meat-based diets use 3 times more water, 2.5 times more energy, which is to say fossil fuels, and 13 times more fertilizers and pesticides than plant-based diets. On a pound-to-pound basis, that adds up much quicker on the negative side for meat. Now, the one exception is livestock raised on open ranges without growth hormones or antibiotics, and sustainable aquaculture. Now, I'm not saying go out and be a vegetarian. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's important to be a conscientious consumer. And that puts pressure on you. That puts a responsibility back on you. And that can be difficult. I know that. But isn't that where you want the responsibility? And we can also buy locally. This is another point that's coming from some of our readings this week. A very ecologically responsible diet is based on local grown products and seasonal products. Tomatoes, for example, these do not grow naturally in the winter unless you use crazy amounts of energy, right? Or you use a lot of chemicals. But most of the tomatoes that we buy, unless they are in season and often local, are only ripened months after they are picked. And chemicals are used to ripen them. In the U.S., food is transported for miles and miles before it's eaten. Sometimes, on average, it's 1,500 miles. That's incredible. Even if we're talking about crops and foods that are eaten right here in Eugene. That system is costly. All that transportation and refrigeration and energy involved in these, it is also socially unjust to farmers and workers that are paid lower wages, especially in developing countries. It is also economically unwise because it supports larger businesses to buy land and labor cheaply in developing countries rather than supporting local economies and farmers and communities. And it is biologically devastating. The impacts to biodiversity, which we talked about. Now, buying locally addresses all of those concerns to some degree. And again, I don't mean that buying food that claims to be local is a good thing, but actually buying food that is local. Now, how do you know the difference? Well, sometimes it's really difficult, but it requires you to be a conscientious consumer. There are foods in our grocery stores that claim to be locally grown, and they were grown in the general region by maybe a large agribusiness using masses of fertilizer and pesticides and energy. Right? To buy from local farmers' foods, what you can do here in Eugene, but it means that you can't get all the products that you want all the time. Things like tomatoes, for example, are not grown year-round. And the last point that I want to talk about today is making environmentally friendly food-related choices. So beyond the food itself, everything from products and the packaging of the food to walking or riding your bike whenever possible, to limiting your use of imported canned foods, limiting your use of foods that rely on palm, which comes from often cleared rainforest lands, and which also often has tremendous devastating impacts on the biodiversity, the wildlife. Growing some of your own food, even if it's not a lot, but trying to grow some food, to composting, to using non-disposable utensils and dishes. Yes, that means actually having to wash your dishes, but using non-disposable dishes. And recycling, and many other things. Now, I've got this table up here which you can read yourself. You can pause this and read through that. Lots of information there. I've tried to summarize some of those main points over on the side of the screen. But go ahead and take a few minutes and look over that. And what all of this boils down to is the future of the planet, the future of so many plants and animals, the biodiversity of this planet, our food system and the impacts that has, even our food, and ultimately us as a species, Homo sapiens. Right? It really does start with you, to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And you've heard that adage too, but what does that mean? It means, don't waste time and energy moaning and groaning about how bad things are. There are problems. We know there are problems. You know there are problems. We've just talked about problems. But do something. These are our problems. People created them. And people are going to have to solve them. And those solutions start with you. Let's stop there for this week. So again, just a preview for this week and next week. This week we had a number of readings in our book as well as the articles. The lecture focused on parts of those readings, solutions, policies, and problems. We have our last quiz this week. We have our last final project progress paper number 3, due this week. Both of those due by Friday. Next week we're going to have a few articles, but no readings in our book. We have a lecture which I'm going to do something a little bit different with, and we have our last discussion board with the first post due on Wednesday and the 2 response posts due by Friday. But the big news is your final projects, the final draft, the final form, the final project, due next week by Wednesday. Okay, we'll see you next week. Oh, and happy Easter egg hunting. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about.